Response to Martin's struggle: is the Christian God evil? Yes. Thanks for asking. Well, on to the next Oh, he makes an argument? I guess I have to actually look at his video and listen to it and stuff. Here we go.
Atheist attacks on religion tend to come from two different perspectives, often combined together into one tome or work. The first one of these being the idea that there is no evidence for God, or there is some explicit reason why God doesn't exist.
Empirical evidence and or repeatable tests for all God concepts that I'm aware of has yet to be offered to anybody and or by anyone. If you have either of those, it'd be great, but God doesn't have empirical evidence because of reasons, and you can't test God because more reasons that are explained very well by theology. well, of course, being if you ignore all the logical fallacies, like special pleading, that it would be required to ignore all the reasons why you can't test or empirically verify God, even though sometimes you can, but God doesn't change. Don't worry, it's all explained in there somehow, eventually, maybe, and if not, a theologian will and or apologist will come along to try to explain those parts to you eventually. Anyways, the only thing ever been offered for any and all gods has been arguments. Now, these arguments sometimes are correctly formatted, but usually contain one or more logical fallacies. Now, I have not run into an argument that is free from logical fallacies as yet for any god, but if somebody has that, it'd be great. Then it would compel me to look further into the matter and investigate the conclusion further. But none of the arguments so far compel me to do so because they have one or more logical fallacies. Weirdly and oddly enough, no matter how many times and how many different ways you point out the logical fallacies to the apologist, they will just refuse that the argument has any fallacies and double down on the same argument, many times just reciting the same argument over and over again. Like the Kalam, for example, that's been demolished and debunked and destroyed by logic and by science multiple different times in multiple different ways by multiple different people, but don't let that slow the apologists down, not for a moment. They're still going to say, it's fine, and they just don't understand it. They're not reading it the right way or whatever, and Okay, so as far as evidence, now, of course, natural language lets you play with the word evidence a bit and be like, well, there's evidence. I had a personal experience of God, or a spiritual experience, or, well, the writings, the holy writings of whatever religion are some sort of evidence. Neither of those things are convincing or compelling evidence, as both those things can be explained by mundane phenomenon. People can make up stories, and other people will fall for those stories and believe in them, even if they're made up. And people can experience weird things in their brains for all sorts of different reasons. But that doesn't mean that it's anything more than the natural and the mundane. And the apologists and theists still cannot show any decisive way to separate a mundane experience that your brain can produce versus an actual experience of the divine. We know that we can cause brains to have a, quote, spiritual experience, end quote, by manipulating the brain, either by chemicals or by magnetic fields or in other ways. So Joe Schmo that's walking down the street that has a spiritual experience of God, well, unless he's carrying all sorts of scientific equipment to measure the atmosphere around him and detect, hey, there was no natural phenomenon that can account for this, therefore it's God, then how would he ever know that it's not a natural phenomenon? Of course, then you have to have also the problem that you could never identify the supernatural in the first place because it is nothing more than an appeal to ignorance. It is seeing an event that you think defies the laws of physics as you understand them. But maybe there's something you didn't know about physics. So that's a problem in and of itself. But leaving all those issues to aside, there might be some sort of subjective evidence that you would cite, like your personal experience or your holy book or whatever. But unless and until you can show that there's an actual phenomenon of spiritual that can be somehow tested and differentiated from the mundane spiritual, then there is no difference as far as I can tell. The experience that Joe Schmo has walking down the street might have been caused by some magnetic fluctuation or radiation, or maybe he inhaled some drugs that were nearby, or maybe he had a brain aneurysm, or any number of possibilities. But to just say, no, it was actually supernatural, it was really a legitimate spiritual experience based solely upon ignorance, which is what it's based upon, because you don't have the test available, and you didn't do the test at the time of the experiment, the experience. You don't have an experiment for the experience. And when we subject people to experiments about these experiences, we see the brain do this one thing in the person, and then we can duplicate that in somebody else. So which one was the real experience then? If we can make you think that it was God and it wasn't God, is that God manifesting itself in a way that is indistinguishable from the mundane, ordinary brain? Well, God's really good at hiding then why posit God in the first place? But okay, enough of that, because your video is not about the lack of evidence of God, which is overwhelming in my view, but whatever. Your video is about the ethical / moral question of, is the Christian God evil? Which we can answer even if God is a fictional character, because you can say that Darth Vader's deeds were evil. And by the way, I don't agree with, say, the spoiler alert ending of Star Wars where Darth Vader does one act of kindness and that redeems him. No. That's not enough. You did all this bad stuff. You're still a bad guy. Yeah, you turn good at the end, but one act is enough to redeem you? I don't really buy it. But it's a fictional story, so whatever. But up until that point, you could say that his actions were pretty darn evil. So even if the Christian God is fiction and not real, I can still judge it as being good or evil. Now, he'll go into the whole straw man of, they don't even believe in objective morality. Well, it depends who you're debating, because some people do think that morality is objective, and some people think it's subjective. Now, I think that the proper way to view morality is that it is objective in regards to the ethics that you hold. The ethics are subjective in the selection of them at any rate. They're ethical guidelines to follow. So there is an object there that you're trying to get to. But the method might be seen as subjective, because the way that you navigate your decisions and thoughts towards the answer is subjective to whatever the moment at hand is. There is no clear-cut one answer for every single problem out there. The order to say, do not kill, is later modified to do not murder, so that we have a nice little workaround. See, if it says don't kill, then we can't ever go to war and defend ourselves. But if it says do not murder, then we can go to war because it's illegal killing, and thus it's not murder. So we have a nice little workaround for our rule now. So it's a nice little subjectiveness that we've put in there. And of course, even if you submit that your morals are objective, if you tie them to a deity, and only if you tie them to a deity, then you have to show that your deity is somehow real, which brings us back to the first problem. But having said all that, let's see what the actual argument is that the Christian God should not be seen as evil.
And there's quite a brutal passage there from Deuteronomy. Now, just as a sort of forenote before I go into talking about how this doesn't contradict with God's nature, any atheists who are going to be responding to this, if you're going to make a video, right, don't constantly repeat yourself by saying, where is your evidence for God? Where is your evidence for God being 100% good and just, right? Because, like, or for that matter, in fact, why does objective morality exist? Because this video takes those as presuppositions, right? If you want to respond to something that talks about these questions in depth, that might be appropriate there, but for responses to this, that is inappropriate because this isn't the question that this video is trying to answer, at least if you want to do things honestly. I'm aware that there are many people within that community, as with any other community, that are going to be dishonest and are going to respond to it anyway, without really acknowledging the overarching picture of what I attempt to set out to answer.
Look, people on no matter what can be dishonest, but I don't think that it helps to poison the well and be like, oh yeah, I know that people can be dishonest. Well, yeah, no bleep, people can be dishonest. You really need to mention that and bring that up? I mean, why not wait until somebody has a rebuttal for your video and then rake it over the coals and say, see, they didn't actually address my argument here, and you could use that as a point then, not preemptively now to be like, oh, people are dishonest, but some of ours are dishonest too. You know, come on, it's just muddying the waters. It's just poisoning the well. Didn't need to be mentioned. Kind of a big deal for me, but, you know, we'll see what you really have to say, because this is a minor point. Still, I'm going to count it against you, though.
So, before we go forward, we need to consider 5 things which I think are very important to the premise of my argument. By the way, I'm not an educated theologian, if you couldn't tell. I'm just a guy who spent, like, a couple of months reading about this stuff, right? So, 4 things that I think we can assume to be true. 1, God is eternal. 2, God is unchanging. 3, God is unknowable. 4, good is an actual presence, whereas evil is merely the absence of good. And 5, God is perfect.
4 things to 5 consider of the 4, 5, whatever. Yeah, it's all numbers. Who cares? It's fine. I make mistakes all the time. All right. So what was your presentation here so far? So God is eternal, unchanging, unknowable. Wait. That third one kind of negates everything else, doesn't it? That's okay. He's going to explain how it being unknowable doesn't really mean that it's completely unknowable, even though it's sort of unknowable. Here we go on his explanation of that.
Now, let me elucidate what I mean by God being unknowable. It means you cannot subsume the entire functionality of God into your head. Theosophy is not a thing, in other words. Theology is, because you can study God, right? But you can never subsume it into your head. And I would say that the same can be said to be true about natural phenomena. There is not a physicist on this planet right now, and there probably never will be, who knows the entirety of how the universe functions, right? And the same is true for God. Now let's go on to the second thing I want to elucidate, because I think the rest is quite clear.
I don't think that really fixes the problem, though. In fact, I don't even think it addresses the problem. You can study God, but you can't know everything there is to know about God. Okay. So you can know some things, but not all things. But how do you know that the things that you think that you know are the actual things? How would you possibly hope to know that? If you don't fully understand God, when it says that it loves, well, how do you know what that word means if you can't understand God? But you can sort of understand. You can get some understanding, but your understanding would be incomplete. Unlike the physics that we could know, if not personally one person, but we could have a database established and have all known facts on the universe in that database. That's something that we can't really do for God. Like, you have the Bible, but it only tells you so much, right? But physics tell you a whole lot more about the universe than the Bible tells you about God, which is really weird considering that for many Christians, at any rate, God wants you to have a relationship with it, but it seems really shy about telling you anything about itself. So I want you to have a relationship with me, but I'm not going to tell you everything there is to know about me. Okay. Weird. I mean, how do you do that then? Base the relationship on what little you do know? Then you're filling in the missing pieces on your own, and you could technically be worshiping the wrong God because your view of God isn't complete. There's some problems there, but I'm sure that the apologists have answers for them. It's just that I would say those answers require a lot more special pleading. And he said that we should just assume these things are true. Or, why? Well, for your argument, yeah, I get that, but why should we think any of these things are correct? Why couldn't God be a thing that exploded and died in order to make the universe? Well, then it wouldn't be your God, I guess. So these particular things only seem to apply to your particular God, perhaps, although they might apply to other gods.
What do I mean when I say that God is perfect? God is perfect means that we have an immaterial being that lies outside of the universe, right? So, which we cannot possibly know, right? At least we cannot subsume it into our head, as I've already explained, right? So, based on that, we assume when we apply this adjective, that all possible positive traits can be applied 100% to this being, right?
Well, you're basing that on our human concept of perfection and our human concept of positive traits, which might not apply to God at all in any way, shape, or form, because it's unknowable. You can only know what you're told about it, and you're not told that much. So how do you know what perfect means in God's view? You couldn't. You couldn't hope to know. You can assume, you can guess, you can hope, but you couldn't really know that that's what it means to be perfect. Maybe God's version of perfect is one of those things that's unknowable about God. Or maybe it's explained in full detail somewhere in the Bible that I forgot about. I don't think it is, but yeah. But it's not, I think, justified to say that all desirable positive traits are automatically applied. But what makes a trait positive? What makes a trait desirable then? And who decides that? Does God decide that as well? Or is it decided because God is those things? And so then God having those things makes those things good somehow. But they're good because they're good, or they're good because God is them, and then that's that one dilemma. What were you saying? Back to the video. Maybe you explain it. He doesn't explain it, but I'm gonna pretend like he's going to.
So God is infinitely kind, infinitely patient, and infinitely just, right?
Wrong, because our beliefs on this planet are what matters to this being. And if you don't believe the right thing, then you're screwed. Unless you have a different version of Christianity that I'm not aware of. Most versions of Christianity that I'm aware of are all about that you have to believe that there's a God, of course, and you have to believe that Jesus died for your sins. And you may or may not have to believe that Jesus is God, but you at least have to accept that he died for your sins, I guess. And I don't know if you have to also believe that he rose back from the dead to be saved. And whether or not you have to be baptized is another question as well. But the basics are there, right? Like, you have to believe in God, and you have to believe in Jesus dying for your sins at the very least to be saved, right? And like the other stuff is like add-ons that may or may not be necessary depending on your theology. But those things we can all agree upon. Well, no, we can't even really agree upon those because Christians can't seem to agree upon even those things. Like, I think that maybe they would all agree that you have to at least believe in God. Otherwise, you're screwed. Although, no, Because I mean, it depends on your circumstance. If you don't really believe in God, or because of your situation, then it's fine because you're given forgiveness because you were ignorant and you can't be blamed for that. But that's only held by some Christians, whereas others say no. See, in the Bible it says that everybody knows there is a God, so there's no excuse. So that tribe, the Piranha people, they're screwed because they should know that God exists and they don't believe in God because the way that they view reality around them doesn't allow them to believe in things like that they can't see, so they can't see God, so they don't believe in it. But God, is going to maybe punish them or maybe not punish them for that, depending on which version of Christianity happens to be true. I mean, that's not a big problem. But okay, so maybe believing in God is important, but definitely you need to believe that Jesus died for your sins at the very least, I think. But that might not be consistent in all versions of Christianity, because it might just be you need to follow Jesus' teachings to be saved. Or maybe you're already saved and you don't need to believe in any of it, which comes with the universalism ideas that some very select few Christians might adhere to. But yeah, let's just simplify all that. Ignore all the different views of Christianity that are out there, because that would really complicate matters to include all that, and just be like, no. See, God's just infinitely patient and infinitely just and all that. Well, no, because you still have a finite life to deal with, a finite life of some person, and God knew. The moment before that person came into existence, knew what that person was going to do. So it knew that person was going to eventually reject it for whatever reason, or not believe in it, or not do the magical things that you need to do to please God. Not in your later terms, obey the rules. And forever not obey the rules, so God knows that you're going to do that, so it has to stamp out that evil. But it doesn't really stamp it out, because it makes the evil exist for all time in a special place of torture. Unless that's not part of your theology, then it just wipes out the evil from existence in an annihilation hypothesis / theory that some Christians hold to. Did I cover everything? Probably forgot. I forgot about the black Jesus, but that's the Israelites. So, are they still Christians? I don't know. Whatever. Back to the video.
So that means that, well, yeah, as I've said, it's perfect. Now, why does this tie into my argument? So, God looks upon you with being obviously 100% just and 100% kind, and has seen that you have disregarded his rules, and you have no intention of coming back. You know why he would know, you would have no intention of coming back? Because you'd completely forgotten the rules, right? If you had any intention on coming back, or you'd ever tried, you would have known those rules, right? And perhaps subconsciously followed them, right? Okay, so we have this situation where the rules have been entirely disregarded, right? And as we all know, following the rules of God is equal to good, and the absence of that is evil, right? And God, being infinitely good and infinitely just, will crush evil where he sees it, right? And since you have disregarded what is good and chosen with evil with no potential way of coming back, then of course he will revel in your destruction. He will love that, because he loves destroying evil by virtue of being 100% good.
So evil isn't a thing, it's a lack of goodness, but not following the rules is now evil. So you're negating goodness by not following those rules, whatever those rules are. Not really sure what those rules are or why you can't just automatically have to follow them, why there's even a choice in the matter. If God really wants to eliminate evil, well, then that seems that it just needs to fill the universe with nothing but good, which means the best way to do that, if you have to have rules, is to have a universe that follows those rules perfectly and can't ever not do those rules. Then you never have evil and you never have to eliminate it, which would be weird, eliminating evil, because evil's not a thing to eliminate. So I don't think you're being really consistent with your terminology here, because on the one hand, evil is not a thing, and on the other hand, it is kind of a thing. So which is it? You can't have it both ways, but your language here suggests two different ideas, at least to me. But I'm trying to understand this from what you're saying here. And in essence, if you didn't follow these rules, then you've subtracted good from the universe somehow. And then God enjoys destroying that evil by what? By removing that person from the universe and annihilating them? But then wouldn't it be better to not have that in the first place? So is God's true goal to eliminate as much evil as possible? Then it would have to create a universe that is full of nothing but evil so that it can eliminate as much evil as possible. But that doesn't sound very good. If God's all good, then why would it allow for any evil to exist in the first place? And if God's going to crush evil, then why is there still evil right now in this very moment? Why is there an absence of good anywhere? Why doesn't God crush all of it instantaneously and not allow any of it to continue? Or does God need a new constant source of evil generated to constantly crush to satisfy its needs? How does this work?
And what that text there is saying is that if you're 100% evil, expect destruction, right? And I think we see some of these things nowadays a lot. Like, I mean, some of the less harsh ones we sometimes see, perhaps like, I mean, you could argue that a lot of these economic migrants are invaders, things like that. But, you know, you see the point here? God is just because he destroys you if you don't follow the rules because you're evil, right?
It's really odd to call an unknowable thing anything at all, but to say just, if you're using the word as I understand justice, no would be the answer, because it's you have a thing that knows what that thing's going to do. That the person in question is going to eventually do these bad things and create an absence of good. And then I'm going to have to snuff them out and destroy them. Why have that person in the first place? Why even allow that person to come into existence? If that person never comes into existence, they can never do those things that you didn't want them to do, and thus you'll never have to eliminate them. The true just way would not be to allow something that you know is going to do bad come into existence. If you know that it's going to do evil and yet you allow it to come into existence, you are evil. If you know that Hitler is going to be born, you abort that pregnancy. If you see baby Hitler, you boot kick him through the window to the curb from several stories up, and then, run over him a few times just to make sure he's dead. Well, maybe that's a bit extreme. But you do not create somebody and or allow somebody to be created that you know will then do bad, and then punish them for doing that bad because you let them be there in the first place. It's not justice. It's just wacky. How does this work?
And that's exactly what, and you can say that for pretty much everywhere in the Bible that hasn't been obviously annulled by Christ and other prophets, right? Because the Bible doesn't function in the same way as something like the Quran, because the Quran is divinely written, whereas the Bible is divinely inspired, and it's made up of numerous different books. That's why Christians don't, for instance, you can have a bacon sandwich as a Christian and be just fine. whereas a Jew cannot, because Christ obviously came in and annulled that.
So the whole Matthew 5:18 part where it's like, for most certainly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not even one smallest letter or one tiny pen stroke shall in any way pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. I guess that just means until Jesus dies and comes back from the dead, those laws are still in effect. Even though it doesn't say that, I guess that's what we have to think that it means, right? I mean, it's not like the Bible takes serious special pleading as it is to figure out what it says anyways. But, or maybe it really means that. And that no law is wiped away until everything is completed. Which it's not, because we're still here. And Armageddon hasn't happened yet. So, yeah, that's kind of a thing. But it just depends on what version of theology you subscribe to. As far as the guy not being well-educated on theology, here's the thing about theology. You don't need to know anything about it, because it's an empty void of nothing. I mean, it really is. I mean, there is no clear consensus you can get from theology, unlike science, which you can. Theology has not produced a system that all theists will agree to under even one religion, let alone the multiple religions that are out there. So it's just about trying to figure out what the book of choice says and what it means. And everybody can say whatever they want, and you don't have to be that well educated to do so. So his level of education to me is, irrelevant. Because the ones that know a lot, they still say the same stuff anyway, so I don't really see the difference. Maybe they use longer, more complex words and bore you with more history of what people thought and when. But for whatever reason, no matter the education level of theists, they still won't offer us that empirical evidence or repeatable test, or even a valid and sound argument. Unless and until we have a logically coherent argument, we should remain skeptical of the conclusions.